Friends, continuing to the chapter, a vivid picture of a contemporary India. To reform or not to reform. Planning and the competition can be combined only by the planning for the competition, but not by planning against the competition. Day to day governance caused us the greatest necessity in the 19th because the old institutions of the state were decaying and the new institutions for regulating the capitalism were too long in the coming. The rot in the older institutions, the brokery, the lower judiciary, parliament, the police, the political parties, public sector services has begun in Indira Gandhi's time, and it is continued as unabated. The new institution for protecting competitive markets under the Act 1991 reforms to regulate, for example, telecom, power, insurance, and the capital markets were still in their infancy. As the decade we are on, it dawned on us that economic growth was not enough. We needed both growth and the robust institution to become a successful nation. On the other hand, a few institutions did work, and it in fact became stronger in the 90s, and they shone brightly in the political darkness. One of these was the Election Commission. The Supreme Court was another. The Central Bureau of the Investigation has also regained credibility to the decade end. Thanks to first to the Chief Election Commissioner T.N. Session and later M.S. Gill, elections became fairer and the ordinary citizens could see the difference. For the first time in the decades, politicians were afraid, and these beer brought a new respect for the laws and realization. And they did not have a unlimited power. Imagine, we thought, if Parliament could be similarly reformed and suddenly begin to attend to its legislative task of debating and passing law rather than intensively debating the irrelevant and the unreal. Imagine if our political parties were to hold free internal elections and there were genuine intra-party democracy, we might see a new quality of the politicals emerging, who were responsive to the real needs of the people. Then, for a change, one of the world's poorest country might take an interest in becoming rich. There are two-legged essays in this chapter. One to do with our economical reforms. In the first, I look at the reforms are of our institutions. The second essay, All Boats Will Rise, seeks to show that the reforms are non-anti-poor. Reinviting our institutions. Mancure Alslam, the American social scientist, warned us by the reforming institution would not be easy. He said that the democratic society tended to foster special interest groups which subverted the dynamism of the society and the market. Writing in 1982, Osland compared the experience of post-war Britain with Germany and Japan. Narrow interest groups were destroyed by the war in Germany and Japan, and they had to begin from the scratches. In the Britain, however, a powerful and a dense network of trade unions and the professional association created institutional sclerosis that dragged down the economy of for decades. Germany and Japan created miracles of economic growth in the post-war decades, while the British economy remained slow and even sick in some years. Osland hoped that a public educated to the harmful effects to the special interest might begin to restrict such behaviors. This is what eventually happened in the Britain, sick and tired of its union and its stiffening regulatory institution. The English overbrought in Margaret Thatcher to right the balance. In India, we began to write the balance in 1991, and partially because we had not had a stronger reformer at the top of like Thatcher. The reformers of our institution has been frustratingly slow. In the essay of our crumbling institutions, I looked at 4 institutions: the brokeries, railways, SEBs, and the judiciaries. Here I return to 2 of these, power and the railway, and also examine the reform of state television, telecom, civil aviation, and water. Does the government own a newspaper? No. Then why should it own a TV channel? This is a question that I have asked Bright and article Arjun Jetli soon after he took over a minister for the information and broadcasting in 1999. He replied that the brokerist in his ministry believed that the government had to own Doordarshan to provide a public service broadcasting. I explained to him that there are far more effective and the cheaper ways to deliver public broadcasting. It cost up to rupees 1000 crore a year to keep the Doordarshan afloat. And if the government brought airtime on the private channels Zee, Star, and Sony, it could beam an awesome amount of the public services broadcasting for a fraction of the cost. With rupees 200 crores, it would become the biggest spenders on the television by far. And such an important power to reckon with that private channels would certainly do its bidding. Because of the competition between the channel, public services program would instantly improve. Added to the pleasure of watching them would be a warm feeling that comes from saving rupees 8,000 crores. If the Prime Minister had an important announcement for the nation, he could easily make it on the private channels. Through a pre-legislative system, the United States government does not own a channel. Yet the President routinely broadcasts to the people. In fact, Americans complain that they get too much of the presidents on their TV screens. If, on the other hand, the government owned a newspaper, no one read it. The government realizes that this and delivers public messages to newspaper through press releases and advertisements. It could easily do the same without owning a station and airing unwatchable programs at a causeless public expenses. Doordarshan represents much that it is ugly about our public sectors. It sometimes invites me for an interview, and when I show up, I find that often no one is there and the studio set is covered in a thick layer of dust. Gradually, the camera and the lights people stared in. The last time I went, I borrowed a duster and dusted off my chair. The interviewer arrived for 45 minutes late. He had no studied the subject, and so the interview was hesitated and dull, and it has left a bad taste. The following days, the primitive New Delhi television, that is NDTV, which produced a news and public affairs programs for Star TV, invited me for an interview on the same subject. This interview was in a clean studio and it began a bang on time. The more importance it was lively because the interviewer had taken the trouble to do her homeworks. Until the mid-90s, our government channel was a clear leader in revenue, if not in the rating. Its advertising revenues were 5 times the combined revenues of all the satellites and the cable channels. At the end of the decade, Doordarshan's revenues were only about one third. This is despite the fact that it reaches twice the number of homes. The private cables and the satellite systems reaches about 35 million homes, while the Doordarshan reaches around 20 millions. This must be the faster the training of any leaders in an market, says newspapers editors TN Nayanan, with 35 millions more homes than the private channels. Why does Doordarshan earns less revenue? Clearly, something is terribly wrong, and Doordarshan needs complete restorations and an attempt gently made but could not follow through because of the change in the portfolios. Like zero-based budgeting, restructuring must begin with the first principle. The first question is that must be asked is why the government should own television and radio station when it does not own a newspaper. Over the years, the national has invested rupees 55,000 crores in Doordarshan. This is not a mean amount, it is equal to 3% of the GDP. If we have sold it off during the new economy boom of the late 90s, we may have got back that full amount. If we sell it now, we may not get back the whole amount, but we will recover some parts according to the investment bankers. The reason is not because of the value of its massive assets, but it is monopoly accepts to the 35 million homes. In the end, government was not persuaded to sell the Doordarshan partially because it had the other one more pressing privatization to look into. But Jetli did the next best thing before he was shifted. He sold off the Doordarshan's time in a large blocks of independent companies, and this did help to repair his finances. In contrast to the Doordarshan, we made a significant progress in bringing about the expansion and efficiency in the telecommunication. Again, it was no thanks to the erstwhile departments of telecommunication, which is in fact did a great harm to the Indian image as a reformer. Even since the first time reform were announced in the telecommunication in 1994, it is constantly subjugated all efforts to bring its competitions, and it became a living example of the ugly truth that brokerage doesn't work on behalf of the people but only on behalf of itself. Through most of the 90s, it was Dot versus the citizen of India. When our economics reforms began in the early 90s, estimated that it would cost rupees 37 million, that is rupees 1,40,000 crores for Indian money, over 10 years to create a modern telecom infrastructure in India. An investment on such a massive scale would create a million of new jobs and bring its new technology and skills. Since our government did not have the sort of money, it decided to open the telecom sector to the private investment in 1994. The government had also seen how private competitions have improved the performances of the other state monopolies, Indian Airlines, Doordarshan and the sale, and it wanted to replicate that experience in the telephones. However, it made the grave error of asking DOT to create and implement a new policy. It was like asking a Bajaj Auto to bring in Honda and Suzuki to compare with itself in the scooters. We should have entrusted the job to an independent body. Precedibly, the DOT becomes came up with a flawed policy that was designed to fail. It was based on a selling license for a cellular services and extraordinary fees to the private competitors, which would lead you to the high tariff for consumers and result in the eventual failures of a private companies. Certainly, the private sector was also to blame for bidding unrealistic fees, especially one irresponsible company which destroyed the field for everyone. As expected, private providers were in a serious financial difficulties by the end of the decade, and the Prime Minister, in frustration, have to take away the telecom reforms from DOT. He changed the minister and passed on to the authority to the group of a minister on telecom headed by Jaswant Singh, who finally gave us a pragmatic policy that has transformed the telecom scene. Apart from waiting to preserve its monopoly, DOT was also wrong in thinking that cellular phones are toys for the rich. It is intensively set extreme high mobile phone tariffs, which only the rich could afford, and it is not surprising that there were very few subscribers. Most other countries did the opposite. They saw the mobile phones as an opportunity for the poor and those in the remote areas. Hence, in China, Bangladesh, the Philippines, their cellular phone became an instrument of development. The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, that is TROI, spent the rest of the decade lowering the high initial tariff. DOT's third mistake was to open a local telephony before long distance, that is STD and ISD. This latter is easier to implement, need less investment, and it would have provided the country a chance to learn from the experience of the other countries. Nevertheless, when the local services was opened up, our hopes rose, and we thought that we would see to be able to choose between the two telephone providers for our fixed phones. But these hopes were soon dashed for the reason that I have mentioned. In a few cities, private services did start, and there the threat of the competition did stimulate DOT. In Erode, for example, you could get a new telephone connections from DOT on the same day and choose from every 22 telephone models. To give the devils its due, during the 90s, consumers were surprised to see a visible improvement in DOT itself. Under the threat of a competitions, it has energized itself and multiple telephone connections from 5 millions in 1990 to almost 30 million by the connections from 5 millions in 990 and ended on 2000s. Better still, its services also improved. DOT rightly proved of these achievements, but it should remember that in China, telephones grew by 20 millions in 18 months alone, from 80 millions to 1000 millions in 1997 to 1998. By 1997, the government has realized the damages that DOT was doing, and it did what it should not have done in 1994. When the telecom reforms began, it set up the TROI to regulate the industry. It staffed it with upright individuals who stood for the customers' interest. TROI quickly set up transparent systems and began to follow the pace of reform. It brought down a cellular tariff, lowered STD bills, challenged to the wicked idea that the cell phone owner should also pay for calls received, and proposed competitions in the domestic long distance telephones. However, DOT in its quest way kept defying the tariff at every steps. Now over in the world, it is a regulatory taken to the court on every order that it passes. Meanwhile, the world also changed. The internet came, the technology for the telephones, televisions, and the internets began to converge. Phone bills around the world began to drop dramatically, and the regulator in the India also responded with a significant tariff drops. Vajpayee government responded to change by the breaking the Videsh Shankar Niham Limited, that is VSNL, internet monopoly in 1998. This was a great moment, and we realized that our last three were modern minds in the government who understood the enormous potential that information technology held for transforming our future. However, devotee remained true to the chapter, and it dragged its heel, not giving a gateways to the private companies for 13 months. With the world moving rapidly and the devotees putting up the hurdles at the every turn, it becomes obvious to the government that devotee was incapable of meeting the challenges of the future. So, as I have already pointed out, the Prime Minister took the responsibility for the policy away from the department. And in 1999, we finally had a sensible new telecom policy. It turned out to be the best important reforms executed by BJP lead government. As a result, DOT was soon corporatized. VSNL was also privatized. The principles of the revenue sharing replaced the concepts of extortionate license fee, and the infant private telecom industry health quickly improved. As mobile calls charges began to drop, the number of cell phones were exploded, and the device is on its way to becoming a genuine instrument of development. The TRI was also divided into a appellate and a tariff setting body. But three remains a huge flaws. The implementation of the new telecom policy remains in the Department of the Telecom Services. Untrustworthy hands also. TROI is financially dependent on the DTS, and this was an undercut its independence. Was the courageous members of the original TROI was shaken. True, the secretary of the DOT was scared at the same time, but that is a poor consolation to the Indian who want their nation to get succeed in the information age. When ordinary men fall, it is sad. When honorable men do, it is a tragic. All it is, as it is, there are too few persons in the Indian public life that invite the administration these days. Some of them were at the TROI, and the students' sudden dismissal came as a great shock. Again, it was a DOT that was behind the mischief. If a telecom future is secure, the outlook for our railways is precious. Every time seems to be have one impossibly romantic railway memory. Mine is of a journey from Kalha to Simla as a 5 years old, when I feasted for the first time on the snow-tipped crits of the Himalayas, and I recounted it my novel. A fine family are railways as a mirrors to the contemporary India, showing some that things is good in us and much that it is bad. They weave the nations together and have made the poorer India Indian mobiles of rupees 50. You can travel to 200 kilometers. They are cheaper than anywhere in the world because extortionate free prices subsidize passengers' fare. Yet, 70 million Indians, mostly in the Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and the West Bengal travel without a ticket everywhere. The railways are the Indian governments in a miniature, inefficient, corrupt, hopelessly overmanned, utterly policed with a shoddy, claudius services. Their power unions restricts downsing or modernization. The fastest train may average 100 kilometers per hour, but they are often late. Yes, Indians do not seems to the mind because they have no other alternatives. Private companies would not dream of transporting goods by rail not only because of high traffics and a constant delay, but because they would be stolen. Hence, even a coal, petrol, and diesel are inefficient transported by the roads. Politicians make investment decisions, and these bears no resemblance to the consumers' needs or commercial considerations. Today, the Indian Railway is in the financial crisis, and if something drastic is not done, it will wither away like the state in Bihar. What are the answer? To become a modern, efficient institution, it has to shed 5 lakh overpaid and underworked employees, whose presence demoralize daily the one who have to work. There are 3 ways to do this. 1. Don't replace the people who retire, but this process will take 10 years and then the railway will be dead. Second, retire 3 out of 4% compulsory at the age of 55, retaining only the outstanding ones. This is how is slow, but it will help to create a climate of excellence. The third way is to offer surplus employees, the generous volunteers retirement scheme announced by the government, but implement it like the best companies. Get rid of the dead woods and retain the good people. I expect we will have to combine all the 3 ways in the railways are to be saved. The second solution is to receive the decline in the freight traffic and regain market share lost to the road traffic. It is a national scandal that it has cost more to send goods from Delhi to Mumbai than forces from Mumbai to London. Because of uncompetitive free traders, thousands of the trucks bring coal from Bihar to Punjab. In 1996, then a railway minister, Ramvilas Paswan, and an irresponsible railway board caught these damages when they hiked freight rates by 22%. Calculations shows that the freight rates could be reduced by 50% and the railways should still make a profit on the freight. It will need a more than a low prices to fix the problem. However, to regain the primacy in the bulk freights, the railway will need a new container terminal with new operators, raise speeds of freight trains, improve communication and signaling. Most important, they will need to change their colliers' attitude to the customer. The threat of a earlier retirement will help, but other incentives and the penalties will also be needed to change the monopolistic take it or leave it mindset. The third and the most important ways to save the railway is to distance them from the government. Rakesh Mohan Community studied the best practices around the world and discovered that the best railway have achieved autonomy from the government by becoming independent companies with an autonomy regulators. With the corporations, they will need to focus only on their core responsibilities and outsource all other distracting activities. Sanitations, manufacturing, rest houses, hospitals, schools, printing, etc. To prepare a leader, they will need to change the process and style. They will have to reduce the over centralization at the board levels and give autonomy to the operating managers. The railways are dead set against these excellent recommendations. They right point out that mere corporation will not reduce the government interferences, and the railways could end up becoming another fourth place rate public sector's undertaking. They are at least third rate right now. The answer, I think, lies in a transparent contract between the government and the railway at the time of a corporatizing that will ensure their commercial autonomy. This may not be enough, but if the status quo remains, then a grand institution will just wither away, and that would be a shame indeed. Unlike the railways and the state televisions, we had at least tried to reform our power sectors. However, if we succeed in reforming our telephones, we have failed in the case of electricity. For the past 25 years, my family has owned a small coconut farm in a village in Maharashtra. If this does not make me a full-blooded Maharashtra, it does make me at least an honorary Maharashtrian in my neighbor's eye. Bikhu, our gardener, looks after our wadi, and we have seen his children grow up nicely over the years. I have always taken a special interest in his eldest boy, and when the Aron power plant came up, I confidently predicted that the Prashant would have shining future. The main obstacle to our village prosperity is pernalling the shortage of power, which enables commercial activity. Although the Dahapol power plant that made Maharashtra surplus in powers, our village does not get our power on Fridays, and brownouts define outer days. Across the labor's harbors in Mumbai, where people get plenty of power and interpretations set up industries, call centers and the software companies, and creates thousands of jobs every day. Who is robbing Prashant on his future, especially when our state has abundant electricity? The liberal revolution that is sweeping the world is being fed in the turns by a series of a technological revolution. In the 80s, it was a telecommunication breakthrough that destroys the old state monopolies in most countries and liberated people from the state control. In the 90s, it was the internet that was leading the world towards a digital economy. Now we seems to be on the verge of an electricity revolution which holds the promises of producing powers quite literacy in each backyards. In a cover story in August 2000, the Economics described the dramatic breakthrough in a Microsoft technology which will all allow the generations of a clean electricity from small fuel cells and gas turbines. Because of the large inflows of venture capital funds estimated to be $800 million in 2000 and the involvement of the multinational like GE and Asia's Brown Brownie, ABB Micro Power should soon become a commercial reality. Experts predict that the world market for these backyard generators will be $60 million a year in a decade. Localized power generation has finally become economically competitive, partially because there are few transmission losses since power does not have to travel across distances. The whole world will benefit from the electricity revolution, but India will be the one of its biggest benefits because we have failed to deliver the decent conventional power. Before we can be worthy of the revolution, however, we have to do a further reform. We have to allow a private tendering of a power for our backyards. Generators will produce one more energy than it needs. Even today, Many of our power plants has surplus powers at a various time, but the government hold that the trading monopoly and it's making a mess of it. A small trader would hustle, make forwarded the contrast and take risk and spot the future and market in the energy. Power trading entitles taking his big risk and brokerages are incapable of taking risk. Instead of becoming a trader, the government should run a power stock exchange which allows a buyer and a seller of power to transit in an orderly manner. The promise of the micropower should not slow our resolve to implement our current power reforms. Unless politicians learn to say no to free or cheap powers for the farmers and brokerages learn to say yes to the liberalization and creating a free market for distributions, generations, transmissions and the trading of power, there will be the little hope. From the impossible situation that we face with our power institution, I turn briefly to the reality, easier and happier, scenes in the air travel. With the liberalization, traveling by air almost became fun. There was a competition in the skies and Indian Airlines responds with a big leap forwards. Meanwhile, Jet Airways came up and it demonstrated how an Indian company could quickly become world class. Through meticulous attention to the detail, outstanding training of each employee and an obsession with on-time arrival, it becomes the envy of a domestic airlines around the world. The airline's passengers' life suddenly seems to have become unbelievable collegial. You could almost coast into the airport without a ticket and know that you would get on. It was as easy as taking a bus to the next town. This was a heaven compared to the back old days before 1991, when you had to beg, lie, plead on your knees for a seat before the imperious duty officers of the Indian Airlines. There continue to be a few inheritant of course. Even in this heaven, occasionally you have to sit on the tarmac for hours awaiting clearance from the control tower. VIP moments was the reason giving, and suddenly you were reminded that you lived in a fourth world century, where a junior minister could delay hundreds of businessmen with impunity. But this too changed by the end of the decade as the government reformed its rule relating to the VIP moment. Dark clouds, however, to gather in these open and sunny skies. Perhaps it was a coincidence, but it was around the time the new civilization aviation minister CM Ibrahim came to the power in 1996. The private airlines started to collapse. The model first went under. So did the East West Airlines. They came the turn of NEPC. Only one serious competitor was left. No one took Sahara seriously and Indian Airlines began to look mechanically monoplastic once again. Instead of encouraging the competition, Ibrahim stopped the entry of Tata Singapore airline venture. It was a big flow to travel and set back to your campaign for the foreign investments. Coming as it did on the heels of the Iran affairs, it sent out a signal to the world that the Indian government could not be trusted. To top this, Ibrahim also supported progress on the new Bangalore airport, which was promoted by the Tatas and Singapore's famed Changi airport. With two successive reservoirs, the government of Singapore turned against us. The Singapore may be a small place, but its $77 billion foreign exchange reserves versus our $25 billion at the time, mean that it has a big clot in the world's market. Next, out to the twisted mind of the Civil Aviation Ministry came a policy that the prohibited foreign airlines from operating domestic flights but allowed foreign investment. In effect, it is also allowed Pizza Hut to operate an airline in India but kept out the airline or anyone who might actually know that the business which might help upgrade our national aviation industry. The policy seemed suspiciously designed to help the Jet Airways and the Indian Airlines retain their oligopoly of the Indian skies. At the point Tata called Ibrahim bluff, they dedicated to the break with the Singapore Airlines and go into alone. Thus fully complying with the new policies, Ibrahim was concerned, but with the help of his brokerates, he created more red tape and someone come again succeeded in blocking their entry. Curiously, then Prime Minister have backed the Tata Singapore Airlines venture as the right things for the country. But it seems that he was too vague to prevail. The situation for the passengers, meanwhile, deteriorated for the several months in the late 1997 and early 1998. The flight controller, sensing a weak government, embarked on a go-slow agitations for more pay. Flights started to get delayed. To the top the passenger woes, the first flight controller were joined by the engineers of Indian Airlines. These engineers were almost the highest paid engineers in India, but they knew that passengers were vulnerable on many routes where Indian Airlines was the only one carrier. Because these events came together, life suddenly became miserable for their air traveler. What is the answer to our trouble? And how do we secure our future in the skies? The obvious answer is to scrap the Ministry of the Civil Aviation and replace it with an impartial regulator, such as the one in insurance, telecommunication, and the power. But this is easier said than done. Even in the telecom and the power, we have not been able to disband the ministries, even though everyone understands that they serve no useful purpose of in the liberalizing economy. Second, we should make Indian Airlines and the Air India truly independent of the government by privating them along the lines of British Airways. The Civil Aviation Ministry has blocked this move constantly in the last decades, and when we finally got our act together and were ready to privatize, there was no takers. The situation of the world airlines also deteriorated after September 2001, but we must persist on this path. Third, strengthen competition in the skies by encouraging and not discriminating against the private carrier. Fourth, convert our airport into the autonomous corporation and gradually private them. Besides, of course, getting tough with the flight controllers and other public servants who have that taken undisciplined positions. Having looked at the usual suspects who figure in our day-to-day life, I turn finally to the more unusual area of water. It has no taste, no color, no smell, no definition. In fact, it is a life itself. Or Antiod de Saintry on the wonders of water. What could be a fundamental to life? Yet a third of our people do not have access to safe drinking water. And this is the most damning measures of our failure. At the main reason is the myth that the water must be free. Because we get it so cheaply, we tend to squander it. The myth is in our collections unconscious heart backs to an idyllic past when people inhabited the earth and they would drink from the streams. Hence, the biblical saying, whoever will let him take the water of life freely. Today, we are the billion people and it costs money to bring water to the people. Unless we learn to pay what it costs, we will continue to waste it. The controversy over big dams has focused attention on the charms liquid. I shall not enter into the dam debate here, but the only point out that we need a large storage spaces because water flow uneventually in the river. During the rains, river basins overflow and runs off. In the dry months, the flows slow down, but people need water round the year, making storage of the river water necessarily, especially as our needs for the water is expected to double over the next 50 years. There is a saying that we never know the value of water till well runs dry. The starting point of the political economy of water is to appreciate that we are running out of fresh water and the greatest scarcity in the 21st century will be that of the water, not on oil or other fossil fuel. The second point is to acknowledge that we waste much of our water today despite great shortage in many parts of the country. We do not meter homes or farms, so there is no initiative in terms of taps or pipes. Worse, we charges only a fraction of what it costs to provide water. Though our local government spends thousands of crores on water, the main benefit flows to the middle and the upper class while are in the decline because water rates to the farmer like electricity rates are slow, then there is no money to maintain the channel. Because of these subsidies, farmers overpump groundwater to grow water guzzling crops like rice and sugarcane. Cheap water is eventually overused and this has turned vast stretches of land into waterlogged and saline waste. Economists have always argued that subsidies are bad. Subsidizers distort prices in the whole economy. They send wrong signals to the producers who go on to produce the wrong things. Subsidies always eat away the fund meant for investment in infrastructure. Worse, the benefits of the subsidies go mainly to the rich and the middle classes. The answer to the water crisis is to price water properly to reflect its true cost. Once this happens, people will conserve it. It will also attract effective private firms to invest in improving water delivery and gives access to safe drinking water to many more. Including the poor people, the poor will pay for water. Even today, they confirm pay while the rich get it free. Private supply of water may seem radical, but in the France, private firms have managed water for more than a century. Britain handed over its water access to the private companies a decade ago. From Indonesia to Mexico, private firms are helping government to improve bill collections, reduce leakages and expand water supply to the poor. The city of the Aires in Argentina has handed over its water to a private company which invested $1 million to upgrade equipment. And this has given a water to 1.6 million additional people without signifying raising water rates. Where did the money come from? From cutting out the Hajj municipal bureaucracy. Country after the country is learning that it is easier to get efficient and a good behavior from a private company than from its own brokery. Besides, governments today do not have the funds to improve water supply. Private companies, on the other hand, have both the money and the management skills. The answer then is to begin the liberalization of water. This means that we must transfer the management of the water from populist politicians and corrupt brocheries to the professional managers. If we begin to learn from the best practices is the rest of the world, we too will begin to give our thirsty the foundation of a water of life. My final example relates to the reform of the institution that impacts on housing and where a vertebral revolution is underway. When I was young, owning a house was a hopeless dream. Either the company or the government provided shelter to the salaried middle classes, and at the retirement one scrambled to find a place of one's own and a low standard of living. But today this is all changed. Even a young person starting a career can put down a deposit of 10% of the cost of a house and can easily raise a 15-year mortgage loan, and this explains why the housing finance business has been growing 35% a year between 1998 and 2002, and why there is a boom in the middle class housing in the Gurgaon, Tans, Powai and many cities. This is a good news for everyone. A construction boom can become the engine of the growth for the entire economy, and especially depressed sectors like steels and cement. Every rupee invested in the housing adds 78% to the national wealth of GDP. House building is also a great generator of the employment. A million new houses creates 5 million new jobs directly and 7.5 million jobs indirectly. Moreover, owning a home brings social ability, as a house owner tends to be more law-abiding and caring of the community. This is not often that one can link the growth to reforms, but one can. In their cases, the housing boom is the direct result of a dramatic fall in an interest rate in recent years from 18 to 10%, combined with rising taxes deduction on home loans. The repeals of the urban land ceiling in many states have increasingly made land available for building and kept properties pricing low. Legislation is already in Parliament which will allow housing loans companies to repossess houses from those guilty of not paying back their loans. All these factors are encouraging banks to give more loans and owning houses that has never easier and more affordable. Having said all that, this has been a small revolution, and the dream of owning a home is still distinct for the most. Of the 30 million middle class families, only 500,000 takes home loans each year, which is about the same number of the cars that are annually sold in India. For an economy that has been growing steadily for so long time, we ought to have experienced a series of construction booms such as Shanghai, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur and any numbers of the cities did in East Asia. Like Singapore, those new looks like first world cities and by a contrast are Mumbai and Kolkata looks like slum. Why is that? The reason is the same sordid tale of a bad, unreformed laws, corrupts and the lazy brokerist, suspicious of the private sector and a government that is far too big for the little things and a far too small for the big things. First of all, unclear titles keep lands away from the markets, but one estimated 50% of the Indian land does not have a clear title. If Thailand could fix this problem and Andhra Pradesh is also doing it, why can't the other states? Second, municipalities in India requires roughly 50 separate permissions in order to develop land, and it takes the 3 to 5 years, which is enough to break the back of any honesty builders. Third, rent control is a powerful disincentive for new buildings. It penalizes the young and make our cities look like slum. Again, the answer is simple. Enhance Delhi's model rent control law everywhere. It protects the interest of both tenants and owners in a sensible way. Although enchanted by the parliaments in 1995, traders in Delhi have prevented this implementation. Fourth, the stamp duties in India are high. They average 10% compared to around 2% in the rest of the world. And this adds to housing cost and resist demands. On the other hand, property taxes in India are too low, 0.002% compared to 1.5% in the world. And this means that little incentive for the municipalities to develop urban infrastructures. Fifth, half the states have still not replaced the vicious Urban Land Ceiling Act, which keeps land away from the markets and mean artificially high home prices in those states. These land markets barriers means that Indian lands cost as a proportions of GDP per capita are the highest in the world, and the housing construction have stagnated at only 1% of GDP companies to 6% in the Brazil, 5% in Korea and 4% in the US. The same goes for housing shares of employment, which is only 1% in India compared to 4% elsewhere. The answer to are blindly clear, and they are contained in the Government Wonderful's 1988 National Housing and Habitat Policy. All we now needed is for a government to act on it. Thank you.